Cape Hollow, Maine 1972. The summer of 1972 was the hottest anyone could remember in Cape Hollow, a small, sleepy town along the rugged coast of Maine. The beaches, usually empty except for the occasional fisherman or dog walker, were suddenly alive with families and tourists, eager to escape the oppressive heat. But there was one beach that no one went to: Drake's Cove. Drake's Cove had a reputation, the kind that older residents would only whisper about after a few too many drinks at the local bar. It was said to be cursed, though no one could quite remember where the story had started. Fishermen claimed the waters there were unusually cold, and that even on the calmest of days, the waves seemed to pull you under, as if the ocean itself had a will of its own. Children who wandered too close to the cove were hurried away by their parents, told that the sand was dangerous, that it would swallow you up if you weren't careful. But Mark Lawson didn't believe in curses. At 17, he was too old for ghost stories and too young to care about the warnings of the townsfolk. He was restless, eager for something more exciting than the small-town life that seemed to stretch out endlessly before him. So when his friends dared him to spend a night at Drake's Cove, he jumped at the chance. It was a Friday night, just after dusk, when Mark set off for the cove. He carried a flashlight, a blanket, and a bottle of whiskey he'd swiped from his father's liquor cabinet. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. The air was thick with humidity, and the only sounds were the distant cries of seabirds and the rhythmic crash of the waves. The path to Drake's Cove was overgrown, the sand thick and wet beneath his boots. As he walked, Mark thought about the stories he'd heard over the years of fishermen lost at sea, their bodies never recovered, of strange lights seen off the coast at night, and of the whispering, always the whispering. The cove was smaller than he'd expected, a narrow stretch of beach nestled between two jagged cliffs. The sand was darker here, almost black, and the water seemed to churn and froth more violently than the rest of the coast. Mark shook off a sudden chill, telling himself it was just nerves, and spread his blanket out on the sand. For a while, nothing happened. Mark lay back on the blanket, taking a swig of whiskey and watching the stars blink into existence above him. The air was still, the ocean a constant, steady presence. But then, just as he was starting to relax, he heard it, a faint, distant sound, almost like a whisper. He sat up, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, a low, hissing sound that seemed to come from all around him. Mark's heart began to pound in his chest. He looked around, but the beach was empty. Just him and the dark, endless sea. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the sand itself was speaking to him, urging him to come closer, to listen. Mark scrambled to his feet, his flashlight sweeping over the sand. That's when he saw them footprints, leading down to the water's edge. They were small, like those of a child, and fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft sand. But there was no one else on the beach, no one who could have made them. The whispering grew louder, almost a roar now, and Mark's fear turned to panic. He backed away, stumbling over the uneven ground. But as he did, the sand began to move. It started as a small ripple, barely noticeable, but quickly grew into a wave, a rolling, shifting mass that surged towards him. Mark turned and ran, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could feel the sand shifting beneath his feet, pulling at him, trying to drag him down. He reached the path, his heart pounding in his chest. But he didn't stop. He ran all the way back to town, not daring to look back until he was safely home. The next morning, Mark returned to Drake's Cove with his friends. They found his blanket, his empty bottle of whiskey, but nothing else. The sand was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But Mark knew better. He could still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. Years later, Long after he had left Cape Hollow behind, Mark would sometimes dream of that night, the dark sand, the shifting ground, the whispers that had followed him home. And he knew, deep down, that Drake's Cove was not just a place. It was alive, waiting for the next fool who didn't believe in curses. Blackwater Beach, North Carolina, 1978. Blackwater Beach was a small, forgotten stretch of coastline in North Carolina, a place that most people pass by without a second thought. The sand was dark, almost black, earning the beach its ominous name, and the water was murky, with a strange, oily sheen that discouraged swimmers and sunbathers alike. The town nearby, once a thriving fishing village, had fallen into disrepair, its docks rotting, its boats rusting in the shallow harbor. It was a place that seemed to have been left behind by time, its secrets buried in the shifting sands of the dunes. In the summer of 1978, the Lawson family moved to Blackwater Beach. Thomas Lawson, a professor of marine biology, had taken a sabbatical to study the unusual marine life in the area, and he brought his wife, Carol, and their 2 children, David and Lisa, along for what was supposed to be a peaceful, academic retreat. They rented a small, weathered house on the edge of the beach, just a short walk from the dunes that stretched along the coast. David, a curious and adventurous 12-year-old, was fascinated by the dunes. They were tall, towering over the beach like ancient sentinels, their dark sand shifting and swirling in the wind. He spent hours exploring them, climbing to the top and gazing out at the ocean, imagining himself as a great explorer discovering new lands. It was on one of these explorations that David found something strange. It was early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon, when David set off for the dunes. The air was cool, the sky soft, pale blue, and the beach was empty, the only sounds the gentle crash of the waves and the distant cries of seabirds. As he climbed one of the larger dunes, David noticed something sticking out of the sand, a small, dark object, half buried in the ground. Curious, he knelt down and began to dig, scooping away the sand with his hands. The object was a bottle, old and weathered, with a cork sealed tightly in its neck. The glass was thick, cloudy, and when David shook it, he heard something rattling inside. Excited, he pried the cork loose and tipped the bottle over, shaking out its contents. A small, yellowed piece of paper fell into his hand. It was brittle, fragile, but the writing on it was still legible, scrawled in a hurried, uneven hand. The message was short, just a few words, but they sent a chill down David's spine. The sands will claim you. Leave now, before it's too late. David's heart pounded in his chest. He looked around, but the beach was still empty, the dunes silent and still. The message had to be a joke, he told himself, a prank left by someone long ago to scare whoever found it. But there was something about it, something about the way the words were written, that felt wrong, felt real. He stuffed the note back into the bottle, shoved it into his pocket, and ran back to the house, his mind racing. When he told his father about the note, Thomas dismissed it as nonsense. Probably just some kids messing around, he said, ruffling David's hair. But David couldn't shake the feeling that the note was a warning, a desperate plea from someone who had seen something terrible. That night, David lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside. The dunes loomed in the darkness, their shapes shifting in the moonlight, and he could swear he heard something whispers, low and urgent, carried on the wind. The next morning, he went back to the dunes, unable to resist the pull they had on him. He climbed to the top of the largest one, the note still in his pocket, and stood there, staring out at the ocean. The sand beneath his feet began to move. At first it was just a small tremor, a slight shifting of the ground, but then the sand began to swirl, forming a spiral that grew larger and larger, pulling David down. He tried to run, but the sand held him fast, dragging him deeper into the dune. He screamed for help, but his voice was lost in the wind, swallowed by the shifting sands. The last thing he saw before the sand closed over his head was the ocean, calm and indifferent, stretching out to the horizon. David's disappearance was a mystery. The town searched the dunes, the beach, the water, but there was no sign of him, no trace of where he had gone. His parents were devastated, and after weeks of searching, they left Blackwater Beach, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. Years later, when the dunes shifted again, another bottle was found, buried deep in the sand. Inside was a note, the handwriting familiar, the message clear. The sands have claimed me. Beware the dunes. The note was dismissed as a hoax, a cruel joke by someone who knew the Lawson family story. But those who lived in Blackwater Beach knew better. They knew that the dunes were alive, that they had a hunger, a need to claim those who ventured too close. And they knew that David Lawson was just the latest in a long line of victims, swallowed by the sands of Blackwater Beach. Silver Strand Beach, California, 1974. The summer of 1974 brought an unusual heatwave to the coast of California, turning the golden sands of Silver Strand Beach into a blistering expanse under the relentless sun. The locals were used to the warm weather, but this was different. The air was thick and still, the ocean unusually calm, its surface a glassy, reflective sheet that mirrored the cloudless sky. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. It was on one of these stifling afternoons that Emily Collins decided to take a walk along the shore. She was 18, restless and bored, with nothing to do but listen to the crackling radio and watch the sweat bead on the window panes of her parents' small beach house. The heat made her irritable, and she longed for the cool, refreshing touch of the ocean breeze, so she grabbed a straw hat, slipped on her sandals, and set off towards the beach. The sand was hot under her feet, even through her sandals, and the air smelled of salt and seaweed. As she walked, Emily noticed how empty the beach was. There were no children playing in the surf, no sunbathers lounging on towels, no surfers riding the waves. It was as if the heat had driven everyone away. She walked for what felt like hours, the sun beating down on her back, until she reached the far end of the beach, where the cliffs rose high above the water, casting long shadows over the sand. It was a secluded spot, quiet and peaceful, and Emily was grateful for the shade. She found a flat rock to sit on and took off her sandals, letting her feet dangle in the cool water. That's when she heard it, a soft, melodic sound, drifting on the breeze. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. It was a voice, singing a slow, mournful tune that seemed to echo across the water. Emily frowned, looking around. The beach was still empty, the ocean calm, but the voice continued, rising and falling with the waves. It was beautiful, but there was something about it that made her uneasy, something that tugged at the edges of her mind. She stood up, shading her eyes with her hand as she peered out at the ocean. There, far out on the water, she saw a figure, a woman, her long hair trailing behind her as she swam effortlessly through the waves. The woman's face was turned towards the shore, her eyes fixed on Emily, and even from this distance, Emily could see the pale, unnatural blue of her skin, the sharp, angular features of her face. The woman's voice grew louder, more insistent, and Emily felt a strange pull in her chest, as if something was calling her, urging her to step into the water, to follow the voice. She took a step forward, her feet sinking into the wet sand, the cold water lapping at her ankles. But then the woman's eyes met hers, and Emily felt a jolt of fear. There was something wrong about her, something inhuman in the way she moved, the way her eyes glinted in the sunlight. The voice was no longer beautiful, it was a trap, a lure meant to draw her into the depths. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the wet sand as she fled back up the beach, away from the cliffs, away from the water. She didn't stop until she reached her parents' house, slamming the door behind her, her chest heaving with exertion. She never spoke of what she had seen, not to her parents, not to her friends. But from that day on, she avoided the beach, the ocean, the cliffs where the woman had sung her eerie, beautiful song. Years later, she would hear stories, rumors of other people who had seen the woman, who had heard the voice, who had walked into the water and never returned. And she would remember the way those eyes had looked at her, the way the voice had almost drawn her in, and she would shudder, knowing how close she had come to becoming one of them.